Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Friends of Park County podcast. I'm Randy Carpenter with Friends of Park County. Friends of Park County is focused on one thing: how we manage growth here in Park County in a way that protects our most precious assets, our communities, our water, our agricultural land, and our wildlife. Our guest today is the distinguished Guy Alsenstzer, Executive Director and founder of Upper Missouri Waterkeepers. Upper Missouri Waterkeepers leverages a combination of strong science, community action, and the law to defend fishable, swimmable, drinkable water throughout the 25,000 square miles of Montana's Upper Missouri Water Basin. Welcome, Guy.
Hello, glad to be here.
Guy was on our podcast earlier in the year, you all might remember, to talk about Upper Missouri Waterkeepers smashing legal victory on exempt wells, those loopholes in state rules that subsidize rural sprawl and development at the expense of senior water rights holders and our rivers and streams. This time, we're going to discuss what's going on in the state legislatures. You might guess it's not all good. There are several proposed bills in the current legislature which that would essentially codify the spread of those subsidies to rural development, that is, those exempt wells. Guy, for those of us who don't understand the intricacies of the law and how it's made, help me understand. I mean, last year in that Horseshoe Hills case, that you won in Broadwater County, Judge McMahon was crystal clear in calling out the state for flouting its own rules on exempt wells. And here we have bills that would again really codify allowing developers to use groundwater without demonstrating there would be no adverse impacts to those who hold existing water rights. Could you help us who thought, guys, it's great, there's going to be tighter rules on exempt wells. Could you help us understand what these new proposed bills would mean to our most precious asset, natural asset, which is water?
Absolutely. I think the bill that folks should look at, even though it's in the garbly-gook of legal language, is Senate Bill 358. That's the primary exempt well bill that's still alive and well in the Montana legislature. And, I really don't think the technical is as helpful as thinking about the broad brushstrokes of what does this bill seek to accomplish. And plainly, what it seeks to accomplish is increasing the exception to the rule. And let's be very clear when I say, what does it mean to have an exception to the rule? Well, the default in Montana as a prior appropriation state is that the basic axiom, first in time, first in right. We have senior water rights in this state. They are constitutionally protected property rights. So really what we're talking about is a private property right. And while you may or may not like the idea of private property rights, it is enshrined in the Montana Constitution. And it is a system that has a science-based standard for understanding who's allowed to put the straw in the proverbial cup and start sucking. And the problem breaks down where people don't want to play by the rules. And when we talk about exempt wells at the very most basic level, what we're talking about is someone seeking to get an exception where they don't have to use science to say what they're going to suck out and how it's going to impact others. And what happens is these types of exceptions, when you start looking at them in the aggregate, they start to have real tangible effects on the things that we all care about. It starts to have effects on private wells. It starts to have effect on in-stream flows. Starts to have impacts on your neighbor's ability to water his alfalfa field, on our world-class wildlife. It's all the things that make us tick and that we care about really get sacrificed underneath the heel of an exception to the rule that's prioritizing new development, externalizing its primary cost on everyone else and everything around it, and they don't have to pay it forward. And that's not only unfair, I think it's an abuse of the legal system and the scientific process that's enshrined in Montana's Water Use Act. So when you're looking at Senate Bill 358, it's doubling down on the use of exempt well for subdivisions in areas where we already know there's not enough to go around. And that does not bode well for any of the things that we all value.
The guy, as I understand it, Senate Bill 358 uh, uh, identifies some areas they call the red areas in which There would be more restrictions on exempt wells, but in the rest of the state, the vast majority of it, um, they would get what, 24 wells essentially free. And now one of those areas is Park County. So Park County, it just feels like we're going to give you 24 water rights that belong to your rancher neighbors for free. Am I getting that right?
Well, a little bit of a nuance there. So,
Okay.
what the bill does at the broad brushstrokes is it seeks to first say, where are the river valleys that we already know there's not enough to go around in terms of water? And for many of them, about a half dozen, it calls them out as the proverbial red zone, where theoretically you wouldn't be able to do any more exempt wells. Then there's other areas designated as yellow areas. And theoretically, that means there's supposed to be more research about whether or not they need to go to a red area. And then there's a petition process to use best available science to put them off limits to exempt wells. But then there's about, I would say, probably close to 80, 90% of the state is classified as a green zone. And in the green zone, green means go. And as you pointed out, Randy, that's where it's a particularly egregious grab and use of exempt wells. And let's be very specific. Since the early 90s, the first time that we really talked about exempt wells and the legislature codified their use in statute, they started with this idea of 10 acre feet a year. And
Right.
let's be also clear that this 10 acre feet a year volume was not meant that you would use that entire volume. It was originally intended to support folks that were doing a homestead, that you bought your parcel and maybe it was 20, 100, whatever acres, but it gave you a reasonable volume that you'd be able to build your house, water your stock, and maybe keep your lawn or some small trophy ranch style garden or something good to go. 10 acre foot.
Makes sense. That makes
But
sense, right?
yeah, that does make sense. Reasonable balancing. And again, if you look at the basic averages of what is a four bed house or a four person family use in terms of water, it doesn't even come close to 10 acre feet a year,
Okay.
right? So what we are really talking about is this idea of what they call in the Latin de minimis. What does it really mean? And the presumption was this is the exception. There's really not a lot of people going out in the hinterlands and doing a homestead or something like this. So it really is not something that we could even measure. What's happened since that time, and of course, what's really relevant now when we're talking about Senate Bill 358, these red areas, these yellow areas, and then this big green area for most of the state, here's where the rubber meets the road. We're not talking about 10 acre foot anymore. Now we're talking about more than doubling. Now we're talking about a presumptive ability to get 24 acre feet a year, which is to say, we're more than doubling. That's a 2.4. And what is that going to do? Well, it's going to allow development to overcome the primary Achilles heel in many of these areas where we don't have enough water by giving them an exception to the rule. And why is this so problematic is the rhetorical question. Well, it's because this has nothing to do with what the legislature and the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation has already determined, which is some significant portions of the state, river basins, right? The watershed principle. We know where the water goes, and we know our alluvial groundwater aquifers are connected to our surface waters. There's no dispute. We know that many portions of the state doesn't have enough water to go around based on what the paper rights already say should exist. And that's really important to think about as a nuance. We're talking about a bill that seeks to dramatically expand an exception to the rule and codify it for more than three-quarters of the state. And at the same time, it completely ignores longstanding, decades old presumptions that we're already way over our skis. We've already allocated on paper more than we have enough to go around. And this is essentially trying to double down and create a new starting point, but it flies in the face of all the science we have. And it also flies in the face of we actually don't know what the impacts are going to be on those that have been using this for rural agriculture, for their own private properties, or for their families. And I would offer this as at its most basic, it's a stealing of private property rights, but it's also terrible public policy to essentially do top-down legislative incentives that prioritize one land use sector above everyone else, and we don't even have a measuring stick for understanding how bad the harm could be.
Okay, so what I'm not quite getting is in Senate Bill 358, it identifies these so-called red areas, um, and then yellow areas. We're just gonna watch it. Um, and then the green areas you were just talking about, it codifies all these giveaways to developers in the rest of the state. So who exactly is going to do these studies in the yellow areas to see if they should move into red areas and all the other areas? Do we just is there development going to happen and then one day that we find, uh-oh, you're now in a red area, which would seem to be a little bit too late. So I don't understand how an area would move from green to yellow to red.
Yep. So let's double down on that. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to understand that these are brand new novel concepts being introduced in the bill, and they're untethered to the scientific tools and regulations that we already have on the books. And to put this another way, the Montana Water Use Act, which is our water rights statute, it already lays out a very coherent math-based and science-based nonpartisan system for telling us where somebody can start sucking water out of a stream or out of groundwater. It already tells you that. And then guess what? It puts the burden of proof on the new development, the person that wants to come latest in the game, to have to prove that they're not going to affect somebody else. The reason exempt wells are so egregious is because it abandons that science-based burden of proof up front and completely converts it into a legal presumption that these newcomers can just do it and it doesn't matter what the impacts are going to be. And that's why it's so troubling, Randy, is because we already know what the impacts are. We already have created, evidence, demonstrable realities of tens of thousands of these exempt wells being used in heavily populated areas, and we're already seeing the bill come due, right? We're already seeing lower stream flows than we've always seen. We're seeing pollution events ratchet up. We're seeing people's wells having to be redug. And again, the reason is that no one's doing the affirmative research to figure this out. And more to that point, DNRC doesn't have the resources to undertake this type of cumulative review. So I would offer that at its most basic, we're talking about a completely speculative new game plan that uses what's supposed to be a tiny exception for an individual family. And instead, it's creating it as a loophole that's being exploited by one sector of our economy. And arguably, it's the one sector that pretty much 9 out of 10 Montanans don't favor, which is sprawl development. And that's what turns public policy on its head. And it's certainly what turns common sense principles of protecting your neighbor and sticking up for local government's ability to meaningfully condition land use. It turns it all on its head by tying their hands and saying these guys get to go ahead and do what they want because he who owns the land and has the money gets to do what he wants. I think that's bad policy. I don't think it's legal, despite them trying to change it. I think it's contrary to the Constitution, and I think it's going to be a recipe for disaster because it eviscerates our ability to know up front what the consequences will be when somebody's allowed to go in and just start sucking the well dry, to speak proverbially. And like you said, it's real hard to know if you don't have the science done up front about what the impacts are going to be. And if DNRC is supposed to figure it out as it goes along, well, what's to stop it from essentially going straight to the crisis zone time and again? And I would offer
Exactly.
nothing. There is no sideboards. This is a handout for one sector of the economy, and it's a very specific sector that sacrifices everything beneath it. It's sprawl development at any cost, and that's a raw deal for Montana.
Yeah, and I just like to, continue that idea about, subsidizing rural development, sprawl development. Most every growth policy, that big picture, long range, vision of the county's future and goals, they all say the same thing, Guy. I've looked at dozens and dozens of them. It's that, we want to protect our agriculture. We don't want taxes to go up. So, far-flung subdivisions, are a drain on, on our our infrastructure and our services. Um, that the growth should happen in town, not in rural areas. And here we have the state saying, you know what, we are going to subsidize developers in rural areas in contravention to what all the counties say they want to have happen. It seems kind of crazy.
It is. And I think it's really important that the public also understands Senate Bill 358 and this idea of this exempt well bill. It's really something that's a handout, but it's also going to work in synergy with a bunch of other bad proposals that are out there, right? And there are a number of different bills floating out there that are certainly part of a common theme. And that theme is about saying we're prioritizing development and the costs be damned. We don't want to know. We're literally tying the hands of local government or of our natural resource agencies to even be able to investigate what the impacts would be. Instead, we're making policy decisions from the legislature saying development at any cost. And it's important that the public knows that there is literally almost a baker's dozen of bills that, if they're all passed, what we're going to have is a race to the bottom for water resources and our wildlife. We're not going to have means in terms of regulatory tools or statutory commands or local government conditions that are going to offer sideboards and science-based investigations to allow informed decisions on the ground. Instead, we're going to have, again, these big presumptions that we have to allow development, we have to allow density, and we're not even going to investigate what the offsite impacts are going to be. And again, when we're doing this in rural Montana valleys that are often, more often than not, rural and arid and water scarce with some of the best last intact wildlife habitat, this is a recipe for disaster.
Well, I did read one thing about Senate Bill 358 that maybe mitigates some of the impacts it would have. It always struck me that that limit of 10 acre feet per year on an exempt well. It's like, well, who's monitoring that? How do we know that they're staying under that limit? Senate Bill 358 would require meters on water bill on these exempt wells. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
I guess it would be a good thing in the sense of we would be able to track after you've already given somebody authority to develop what's going on. But I think the big back end there is a presumption that DNRC actually has a meaningful, human resources in there to actually review these files. And according to former DNRC Director John Tubbs, who should know more than anyone else, ran the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation for more than a decade under several administrations. He says that nobody looks at that. It goes to a round file. It sits in the proverbial, filing cabinet and collects dust. And moreover, there's no regulatory mechanism that forces them to actually take any action on that if the data, if it was reviewed, actually demonstrated, hey, we're having a cumulative net loss in a particular aquifer, or requires any type of study about how, if we put in, in one section of a river valley 3,000 doors over the next 10 years, there's no mechanism to force a hydrologic analysis of what is the net effect on in-stream flows on the nearby surface water. Again, to your point, what good is an after the fact metering and record keeping if it's not tied to any type of anticipatory and preventative mechanism that stops the harm from occurring up front? That's what our constitutional requirements demand. And that's the type of sound public policy, which is embodied in this idea of the preventative approach and precautionary principle. And instead, we seem to be abandoning that. And I don't think citizens should be happy about that. And more to the point, I think we should be telling our legislature this is a bad deal. It's going to result in preventable crises.
Well, please tell me that there is a bill that is going to fund DNRC to do all of this research and monitoring that really would be necessary if this bill is passed.
I don't see such a companion bill, Randy.
Yeah, I didn't think that would be the case. So, but you brought up John Tubbs. I read a few guest editorials in the Helena IR, the Flathead Beacon, the Daily Interlake. These were written by senior water rights holders and also by John Tubbs, as you mentioned, as the former director of Montana Department of Natural Resources. They all have different titles. Uh, they're talking about Senate Bill 358. One is exempt loophole is a handout to developers. Another one is water isn't free. Exempt well policy pretends it is. And then development by exempt well is theft, not a compromise. Um, all different titles, but they all lay out the facts behind the exempt well loophole for developers of rural sprawl development. So I'll add links to those guest commentaries on our YouTube page where you can access this recording because I thought they were really well written, just by ranchers who, who are concerned about their water rights and their ability to continue to make a living on the land, as well as by really one of the leading experts on this policy, John Tubbs. So I really would highly recommend you read those guest editorials. So when you mentioned, Guy, that there are a suite of bills that would, in a perverse way, complement Senate Bill 358, both House bills and Senate bills on that it would affect our ability to monitor and regulate both water quantity, Senate Bill 358, but also water quality. Can you give us a brief overview of what those are and what they would mean?
Yes, I can. Well, I want to start with the stuff that's closest to this idea of exempt wells and subdivisions, because
Yeah.
that seems to be stuff that we're already waiting amongst it. So let's keep on going there. Something that folks should be aware about is this tension, and I would offer a basic planning principle, which is public policy and planning generally has favored this idea that we want to centralize wastewater treatment and public water supplies and have accountability frameworks. Put another way, we want to have sideboards, right?
Yeah.
We want to be able to make sure that these bigger systems that are serving a good portion of citizenry are not only using good technology, but we're not cashing checks that we don't have a balance for. And you do that by using centralized wastewater treatment, which require permits and evaluative processes that design, infrastructure to be able to adequately control pollution. So we're not destroying the environment, we're not creating public health crises, what have you. And the same goes for the public water supplies, right? We're making sure that there's an adequate water supply so that somebody has a reasonable expectation when they turn their faucet on, they're going to have cold, clean water. And there's good public policy reasons behind that, going all the way back to the age of Rome. That being said, we are seeing a suite of bills that are getting away from that. And again, these really go with a theme of saying development at any cost. And I want to talk about first, very briefly, House Bill 629.
Okay.
629 creates a loophole that is now talking about if you're a new subdivider and you're going to subdivide and you're within this arbitrary 500 to 1,000 feet circumference of an existing centralized wastewater treatment facility, you, the developer, have unilateral discretion whether or not you want to hook up to it. But
Wait a minute. I'm a land use planner, so I've always understood that the law is if you're within that distance, you must hook up to a centralized water system and wastewater system. And just for folks out there, it's important to realize that with exempt wells, some septic systems. And when you're on a centralized water and wastewater system, there's one point of control that you can monitor, which is being monitored both on the wastewater and water side. But when you've got exempt wells and septic systems, you have literally tens of thousands of these points of pollution that you really can't monitor effectively. So I'm really surprised to hear that they're saying that if you're that close to a centralized wastewater system, you have the option as to whether or not to hook up.
yeah, so let's be clear. In the prior 2023 session, we addressed this idea of adjacent new development, which
Hmm.
is adjacent to a centralized facility. So we're talking about anything under 500 foot. And
Yeah.
there, as best as we can tell, they're not monkeying with it. There's still the presumption that you have to hook up unless you can do mitigating
Okay.
exceptional circumstances. But
Okay.
now we're talking about one layer of the onion removed, right? Now we're talking about 501 feet to 1,000. And now we're talking about, again, how what role does local government play in this? Usually, local government wants to not see sprawl. They want to see better accountability because it allows them to better plan to help the greater good. And
Right.
centralized systems are a great way to do that. It also helps share the ratepayer tax burden, which reduces our rates, and it improves public health, safety, welfare. But now with 629, if the developer is able to essentially say, well, I don't want to hook up. And yet, on the conversely, the centralized system has no option. So if they want to hook up, you have to accept them.
Right.
And that kind of turns on its head a couple of different basic engineering principles, not the least of which is, well, wait a minute. What if you're undergunned and over capacity and you don't have the resources to do an upgrade and you're being required to now accept these? How does that work? Well, that works synergistically with another bill that's out there, which is to say we have other bills that are right now churning their way through the legislature that is talking about this idea of, well, what happens if you are in that exact scenario where you're undergunned and over capacity and you don't have the ratepayer base or a plan to develop out there? Well, House Bill 534 would allow a water sewer district to expand their service beyond their existing capacity, yet they don't have to have a proven and enforceable plan for developing that new water supply or waste disposal. So that's essentially locking in new development, right? While creating a perverse incentive to rubber stamp pretty much any plan down the road because you're going to create an existential crisis. Like what judge is going to be out there saying these people can't flush their toilet or turn on their faucets, right? There's going to be like a race to get it done no matter the cost. And when you type House Bill 534, this idea of you can accept capacity despite not having the actual capacity right now, and then you tie that to House Bill 629, allowing permissive joinder if the developer
Oh
wants,
man.
you're creating
Yeah.
you're changing fundamental concepts of Euclidean zoning and land use
Yeah.
over the last 80 years. It's turning it on its head. And when you start removing other bills and adding them in, which are, for example, you're removing the idea that a local government is allowed to condition new subdivision on the basis of water resources.
Right.
Now we're talking about removing under what is it, House Bill 658, removing the ability of a municipality or a water sewer district to condition new development in any way that would be more stringent or onerous than an agency rules. Well, doesn't that mean we're kneecapping local government and local independent systems in their ability to say, well, hey, we don't have a plan, we don't have the funding, and yet you're having to accept them. And at the same time, isn't this also bad if at the same time the legislature is lowering the bar of pollution control and lowering the review scrutiny of cumulative impacts of accepting new dense development? I would offer, yeah, this is a race to the bottom. We're both, we're creating perverse incentives for creating sprawl with exempt wells. With exempt wells come septic systems. And then at the same time, we're trying to limit a county or a local water quality district's ability to say, well, hey, there's public policy in saying if you're going to use septics, you got to use the best out there. Well, guess what? Now there's new bills proposed saying we don't want you to be able to do that. You have to you have to use the new low standards that we're proposing as a statutory law for those same agencies. And at the same time, you're putting developers in this unique, novel position of they get to say whether or not they want to do it. And as we all know, most development occurs based on the return on investment. So let me be very clear. It is usually far more cost effective to put the burden on future purchasers in interest, i.e., the future landowner, to have to install a septic and deal with water supply than it is for a developer, particularly if there's impact fees to hook up to a centralized facility. So what does this all mean when you line it up? Well, Randy, I think it's about saying we don't care what the offsite impacts will be for water, for wildlife, for public health. We want to allow as quickly as possible the build out of new development. And this definitely aligns with the governor's prerogative out of the workforce housing. But I would offer, does it have to be an either or? And I think the answer must logically be no. that these are not mutually exclusive principles. You can still protect public health, safety, and welfare and look out for your neighbor and respect private property rights and condition new development in a way that it's not a race to the bottom. But that's not what we're seeing in this session.
Well, it's worth remembering that if you're tying all of this to the issue of affordable housing, gee, we need more affordable housing. Who could disagree with that? I totally disagree or agree with that notion. So do you. We need affordable housing. Um, but just remember that affordable housing can only be done in cities and not in these rural areas. I just, you know, giving these subsidies to rural developers in the name of affordable housing is a pretty crazy notion, it seems to me. And it just seems to me that it's putting the risk of, future water degradation and future, loss of water quantity on senior water rights holders, on current water rights holders, because they're going to be accepting the risk now, and that just doesn't seem fundamentally fair.
Yes, I think you're totally right, Randy. This is about a land grab, and it's about prioritizing one land use pattern over everything else, and at the expense of everything else. And clearly, the bills that are being written, whether we're talking about House Bill 681, limiting the scope of local government authority over water resource impacts of new development, or we're talking about Senate Bill 262, which is trying to eliminate our Montana Environmental Policy Act review of subdivision pollution impacts, or whether we're talking about House Bill 614, right? Changing the status quo of zoning law to allow a county commission, right? A 2 to 3 vote could eliminate your longstanding zoning district that protects rights that have been on the books for decades. We are talking about bending the knee to one land use, and they are able to externalize the costs of development. They're going to be able to build as cheaply as possible. And who's going to foot the bill? The bill will be paid in terms of the cost on our environment, on neighboring landowners' private property rights, and on long-term cleanup. And that is not fair. It's certainly not science-based, and it's terrible public policy.
Yeah, you would like to note a few other bills that are not so much about water, but about land use and about sprawl. Um, you mentioned House Bill 614 would allow county commissioners to terminate a citizen-initiated zoning that, landowners spend thousands of hours of their time developing and tens of thousands of dollars of their money to develop a zoning district that they want. But this would allow county commissioners to terminate those zoning districts if they create a larger zoning district around it, which is not defined. There's Senate Bill 336 would put limitations on regulating short-term rentals. Short-term rentals can have some benefit, but they're really, taking the power away from local communities to regulate those as they see fit. And House Bill 714 would loosen regulations regarding family transfer exemptions to subdivision, which has been going on, sort of a loophole that ostensibly is like you own some land out in your ranch and you want to be able to, chunk off a piece of it and sell it to your son so he can establish a home there, and that you don't have to go through subdivision review to do that. That's great, but it's been the subject of hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of abuse. So they want to make it easier to abuse family transfer exemptions. But that House Bill 262, which you mentioned, you said it would eliminate the Montana Environmental Protection Act, MEPA, from subdivision review.
Yeah, so let's talk about that one. It's Senate Bill 262. And we have a number of different statutes in Montana that talk about how do we protect public health, safety, welfare. And those, as they stand today, unless these bills pass, there is, in fact, a coherent array. And the bite at the apple starts when new development, a new subdivision proposed, it goes to local government. And in my belief, that's the proper means for the first vote up or down, right? And the first conditioning. After the vote up or down, that subdivision has to also undergo theoretically the water rights review if they're not hooking in or don't bring a water right to the table, right? So that's a DNRC thing. And then there's this piece from DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, which is called the Sanitation Act. And let's talk about that act a little bit because
Yeah.
it's if you look this stuff up, you're going to be like, what in the world is this? What engineer wrote this? And you're right. This is a law that predates what we call the modern environmental laws. It predates the adoption of the Montana Constitution that we know and love. And the pieces that are unique in it is, it talks about basic engineering metrics for how are we going to do business. And the important part that 262 relates to is right now, the Montana Environmental Policy Act, which is our look before you leap statute, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't dictate an outcome. It simply says every single executive agency of the state has to do some sort of environmental analysis, particularly of cumulative impacts, when it's making a final agency decision. And an agency decision should include, of course, the Sanitation Act, which includes looking at, really sewage and the adequacy of sewage treatment for things that don't require a formal pollution permit under the corollary Montana Water Quality Act. Now, why you might ask, why is it a big deal if we're not doing a cumulative impact review for the Sanitation Act, given you just said it predates modern environmental laws? Well, the issue is that Sanitation Act really only looks at on-site impacts. And it really concerns this idea of like,
Right.
if you're all having mixing zones
Yeah.
for, 30 houses on a 40-acre parcel, it's talking about, are you going to have your septic mixing zone go onto your neighbor's lot underground, right? That kind of stuff. It's not looking at, well, what's the impact of 20 of these 30 lot parcels within a close proximity with a stream running through them? No one's looking at the cumulative impacts there. And MEPA requires that type of review. It requires the agency to look at this new proposal in conjunction with other uses and actions of the same type in the same geographic area and looking at the past existing and reasonably foreseeable impacts of what it means to adopt this decision. And without that type of review, guess what? We are handcuffing the ability of our expert agencies to identify preventable harm outside the political boundaries of new development. And so I would offer that this is probably one of the most egregious rollbacks that we're seeing is this idea that we're purposely seeing a bill try to restrict the ability of experts to understand what the cumulative impacts are going to be and to prevent the proverbial death by a thousand cuts.
Boy, I thought our Montana Constitution would really kind of prohibit this sort of thing.
Well, I would offer it should. And unfortunately, if the legislature passes this, I think there's going to be a good number of HOAs or other folks that are concerned that would have a very strong legal challenge to it. And, I just hate to be in the time and place in the world history where everything just has to go to the courts
Yeah.
instead of having a reasonable debate and a civil dialogue saying, this is not good public policy. It's contrary to the public interest. It handicaps our agencies' abilities to make informed decisions. It stymies local government from protecting neighbors, and it restricts us from fundamentally making decisions that benefit the public good, and instead offers us a very myopic and view of what's important. And in this case, it would simply say all we're looking at is one political boundary of one subdivision, and we're not looking at it in relation with anything else. And let me tell you, groundwater underneath of a new subdivision doesn't give a damn about
Yeah.
what the political boundary is. And when, it's the same adage that we teach our kids when they're in grade school about, putting in the green dye in the cup. How many times can you put green dye in before the whole thing goes green? Or likewise, how many straws can you put at the cup sucking at the same rate before you start to have a measurable decrease? Well, these are, in fact, the nuts and bolts of what's happening in Montana's river valleys. And we are seeing a variety of bills in this session that are blatantly trying to tie the hands of our decision makers in being able to recognize and prevent those harms from occurring. And that is tragic. It's going to result in expensive problems on the ground. And I would offer most of it's illegal.
And not only handicapping the state agencies, but it flies in the face of this notion that most everybody agrees with, which is the more local control you can have, people who understand the land, the water, the communities of a place should have more local control, and this just again flies in the face of that.
I agree that it throws local control out the window. It makes it totally an empty gesture to having, real democratic Republican style government, which is to say democratic republics, right? It started with the rule of the people at the very basic level and says your state or your federal government needs to only deal with those, 30,000-foot level things that local government can't really solve. And here we're turning those concepts on its head. And to be clear, that's the system of government that Montana and most states in the United States have used for decades, if not over 100 years. So this is very problematic. And I would offer, it goes farther than that because we're also talking about a suite of bills that are specifically restricting our state agencies from even using
Yeah,
best available science to be able to judge harm for the
yeah,
most pervasive pollution problems facing our rivers. This has the one logical leap beyond local land use control, this idea of subdivisions, of not being able to look at cumulative impacts. Well, where does, when you start cashing those checks, where does that bill come due? Often it comes due in the rivers, right? Because in Montana, it's no secret, the vast majority of our aquifers, almost every time, are connected hydrologically and in terms of fade and transport of pollution. They go to those local creeks and streams and into the main stem rivers. And those main stem rivers, sadly, of those that have been assessed, we're seeing, particularly in Western Montana, more than a third are polluted. That the federal government and our state agencies have already recognized they're polluted. And that's not good, people. That means that they can't even support our native wildlife right now. And we don't want it to get any worse. And instead of being able to recognize these pollution problems and develop cleanup plans and do, public-private partnerships to clean it up in a timely manner, we have bills such as House Bill 664 that's literally trying to eliminate science-based standards for nutrient pollution. So nitrogen and phosphorus, the things that are the most pervasive pollution problems in the vast majority of waters across the United States, we're trying to eliminate the standards and the measuring stick for judging harm because the reality is most of the regulated sectors don't want to invest in the technology to control the pollution. And it's not only obscene, it's absurd. It's like we're going back to the dark ages where the Cuyahoga River was on fire. If we don't measure it, then there can't be a problem, which is not only a logical fallacy, but it's going to result in massive, expensive crises, ecologically speaking. And it's going to also kill off probably what most people should relate to, which is, it's our water, it's our wildlife, it's our Western heritage, and it's also our outdoor economy. It's the second largest GDP to this state, and yet we're sacrificing it needlessly on the basis of partisan prerogatives about, we don't want to recognize there's a problem and we need to make generational investments. So let's just not measure it anymore. That's not sound public policy. It's certainly not science-based decision making, and it's going to be disastrous if these things get pushed through because it's going to require litigation and conflict where it's just simply unnecessary.
well, it just feels like, we've got problems. You just mentioned, water degradation and impaired streams, of wells running dry and uncertainty about the future. I mean, that's just now. When you add, let's just say, 100,000 people as state's population, which will happen, within a few years, really, um, that will, that problem that we have now with water quality and water quantity will get worse. And instead of anticipating that and dealing with today's problem, we've got bills that would exacerbate these problems. It's pretty frustrating. And what I would ask, Guy, is so what can people do? What's the best way for them to let their legislators, their representatives know that these are not good bills and they need to oppose them?
Great question, Randy. I would say first and foremost, knowledge is power. It always has been, it always will be. You need to educate yourself and do your job of reading the plain language, and then I would strongly encourage you to go to either Upper Missouri Waterkeeper's website, Friends of Park County, Montana Environmental Information Center, other NGOs that are trying to provide knowledge to the public about here are the real world consequences that are largely negative for many of these bills. And then once you're educated, put in your own words, call
Yeah.
your legislator and email them and try to get them to actually meaningfully respond to you because we do have a citizen legislature in Montana. I don't think most folks have a malicious intent, but I
Sure.
don't think that there's also good decision making happening. I think there's a lot of rash, uninformed decision making happening. And in Montana, we have a unique legislative process that allows citizens to be directly involved. And as the old saying goes, if you don't vote, don't complain. Well, this is the time and place where you should educate yourself and then make your voice heard to your legislators. That's both the House and the Senate. And I would also say this is a time and place for you to write an op-ed if you feel powerfully about a particular issue. The more that we as citizens speak up and use our voices in the democratic process, the more solidarity we build and the louder and more powerful we become when we are united. So this is the time and place to make your voice heard, to educate yourself, and to support organizations that support the interests that you believe in and the values that you want to protect.
Well, on that inspiring note, I'll say a couple things. One is that, yes, go to the Upper Missouri Waterkeepers webpage, Friends of Park County, MEIC, where you can educate yourself. Um, and that, well, let's just wrap it up with that, Guy. Once again, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be in touch soon as we monitor the session. And to all of our listeners, I'd appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe to us on social media and visit our website at friendsofparkcounty.org. You can find this podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, I'd like to thank our supporters who make this work possible. We are deeply grateful. So until the next podcast, have a great day. Thank you, and thank you again, Guy.
Appreciate the opportunity. Talk soon.
Thanks. Bye.